Hi everyone and welcome to the News Agent podcast. I'm Susie Lysett, Content Manager at Goodlord, and this episode is a recording of part 2 of our Renters Reform Bill special webinar. When the bill was announced, our speakers, Goodlord's Oli Sherlock and Dutton Gregory's Ryan Heaven, jumped on a webinar to talk through everything, but they found that the hour wasn't enough, so this session covers what they didn't have time for in the first session. That means timelines for the bill, lessons from Scotland and Wales, and the top questions asked by agents. So, without any further ado, on with the podcast.
Good morning, everyone. Happy Wednesday. Nearly said Thursday then. Good morning, you all. Welcome to the second part of the Renters Reform Bill special. For those of you joined on the previous session, you may remember that this was designed as an overflow because actually we only got part way through. The last webinar we did on this was actually a record-breaking webinar for Goodlord. We had over 1,000 lessons professionals joining us and over 250 questions in a single-hour session, hence why we're gathered here today. So hopefully we can finish the planned sort of slide set, answer more questions, and also go through maybe a bit more about what we know now of the bill a couple of weeks on from the last session. Of course, this is an evolving piece and will continue to evolve, and we're going to talk about that evolution and timeline today alongside Ryan Heaven, who'll be joining us shortly. Ryan is for a solicitor at Dutton Gregory and will introduce himself in a brief moment. My name's Oli Sherlock. I'm Director of Insurance at Goodlord, and I'm going to be supporting Ryan to go through today's session. Okay, so for those of you joining as well who don't know who Goodlord are, we're a pre-tenancy business. We automate and simplify the pre-tenancy process and give you the ability to hopefully have more time back, provide a better user experience to your tenants and landlords, whilst allowing you to focus on things that drive revenue and growth in your business. We provide revenue and growth products and services such as rent protection insurance, such as landlord terms of business, rent collection, lettings accounts, and tenancy services. If you want to know more about what we do, please do visit our website at www.goodlord.co, and you can book a demo there. Like most of these sessions, if not all of them, it's not really about Goodlord. It's about the legislative change that we're going through. And hopefully by supporting you through this, whether you're a customer or not, we can support you and your business to be in better shape ahead of these the impending changes that, for this purpose, the Renters Reform Bill are going to bring. Okay. Good morning, Ryan.
Hopefully. One moment.
Hey, you are indeed.
Hello. I'm still here. I'm here.
How are you,
morning,
Ryan?
Ollie. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, good. It's a nice sunny day to be indoors.
Indeed. And we're back for a second time because I think when we started this a couple of weeks ago, we thought we're going to do one session on this and we're going to probably revisit it in a few months' time. But actually, we're completely bowled over by, one, the amount of interest, but the clear need, actually, that lettings professionals have for kind of support and as much education as we can possibly give. And I think that's the caveat, right? We're still in the middle of this and we will be for some time.
Yeah, arrogant of us to assume we could get through all of it in an hour.
Yeah, stupid, I would argue. Ryan, just give me a little bit of background on yourself before we kick off, because some of the people joining today won't have joined the first session. Just give us a bit of an insight to your background.
Great. Well, I'm a solicitor at Dutton Gregory. I've been working in landlord and tenant sector for about 8 years now. Dutton Gregory run, well, perhaps most famously, the Property Market Legal Helpline. So if my voice sounds at all familiar, it may well be we've already spoken before.
Fantastic. And we're here today to take you through the final stages of the originally planned webinar. So we're going to talk about a number of sort of issues around this. We're going to talk about, first of all, a survey that Goodlord have conducted in the last few weeks. I want to share some of the detail with you, just to give an insight to the people attending as to where really the concerns lie from lettings professionals. Ryan, they're going to take us through the expected timelines. I think that's normally at the top of people's question list in terms of when does this thing actually happen. And we're going to also look towards Scotland and Wales, because, of course, they've gone through legislative change ahead of England. And I think it's fair to say there's some pointers within there that we can maybe learn from. So Ryan's going to take us through his view on that. And we have a live Q&A session at the end as well. We've actually got questions from a lot of you who are joining already as part of the webinar invite. So thank you for submitting those. We will cover those either through the session or at the end of the session. We also have the Q&A switched on from the very start too. I can see we've already had a few questions in there. We're going to come to most of these. One of these, though, somebody who hasn't left their name, but good morning to you nonetheless, asks, can agents and landlords please sign a petition? It's a petition at the Parliament website for the retention of a short hold tenancies. It would be good if the content of the Renters Reform Bill were not entirely determined by activists. I wonder which side of the fence this person is in terms of thinking if this is a positive or negative thing. I think it's fair to say, well, whilst I fully support that level of sort of dedication, saying let's try and challenge this, I fear we're past the point of challenging whether we move to assured tenancies full stop. This is something that is, for all intents and purposes, nailed in. It's now a case of actually working with that framework and understanding how we can adopt assured tenancies moving forwards rather than, say, challenge that. I think we're past that point, in my opinion.
I'm completely with you. Section 21s are going. That's not open for negotiation. It's just what other structures can be put into place to allow landlords to give notice in certain circumstances, maybe assist certain sectors of the PRS. So, for example, students who are generally the exception to most normal rules. So, yeah, I'm with you.
And nonetheless, though, clearly there's a mechanism there to raise these kind of concerns, right, through that parliamentary entry point. So if you do feel strongly and you do have some hope there that can be reversed, then of course I'm absolutely supportive of people doing that. But I would fear at the moment that's pretty futile given how far down the road we are on that particular point. I think there's other areas actually that will and can and probably successfully will be challenged through this process. And today, Ryan and I are going to talk you through what that looks like and actually talk about how you can go about doing that maybe in more detail. So let's get into it. Next slide, please, Sarah. So as I said, I conducted a Renters Reform Bill survey and we wanted to understand exactly where the sentiment was from lettings professionals around the bill. There's going to be more details around this being released over the coming weeks as well, and we'll continue to use that kind of size across the market to get good insight and try and provide that back to you, because obviously, concerns starting off are quite important for us to understand, to know where we can support both from an education perspective but also from a business perspective. And I think one of the things we're going to look back on today, Ryan, is the tenant fee ban, because that was the last part. That was the last major legislative change that we've been through as an industry. And I remember back then being relatively surprised how some businesses had sort of prepared themselves for change, and either they were well ahead of this, they had really sorted out what the effects were of that change and ultimately set their business appropriately, or there'd been no work whatsoever, waited for the change to come in, and then were scrambling somewhat. And it feels that we're in a similar position here. 29% of respondents felt that they were prepared for the changes coming, which is no great surprise. We're still early on this, right? But I think the other side of this, 27% of respondents do not feel prepared at all. And that's exactly why I think these kind of sessions are hopefully important. If we can add, just one element of value through the hour, then hopefully it's been worth people attending. And I think you see that the bulk of people are feeling somewhat prepared. So we're kind of in. We understand what the challenges are. Maybe we're not quite figured out how to meet those challenges, which I think is probably a fair assessment given where the bill is at the moment, because we're still waiting for an awful lot of clarity, especially on particular areas. I think what's more interesting is the areas of concern. And interestingly, Ryan, 49% of the respondents said the abolition of Section 21 was their biggest worry. Why do you think that would be?
I think it's probably just the biggest change for agents. So I agree that Tenant Fees Act is probably the most apt comparator because it's the most recent bit of major legislation that the PRS has received. But Tenant Fees Act was really about governing the agent's relationship with landlords and tenants, whereas the Renters Reform Bill is far more fundamental than that. It's about landlords' relationship with tenants, and agents just happen to be a part of that process. And so in terms of the impact on agents, I think this is probably why a lot of agents feel quite prepared, because actually it probably doesn't change that much. But the Section 21 is probably the thing that's concerning agents' clients the most, and therefore is causing agents the most headache. And you can appreciate why that might be. If landlords are saying they are going to leave, the sector entirely, just sell up because of Section 21 going away, then that takes away revenue from agents and therefore is causing them a worry. So like I say, I think the worry is mostly about the broader impact of that change, rather than agents not being able to serve Section 21 specifically. I don't think they mind not being able to serve that. It's just the impact it's going to have on their business.
Yeah, and I understand that to a point. I suppose my challenge would be that the grounds in Section 8, if the bill is delivered in a comprehensive way, actually meet the demands of the market in the first place. And I think my side note to that is that we're hopefully providing calm to landlords and educating them on the fact that actually there is a provision in the bill at the moment. And the provision in the bill is actually quite generous on the basis that we accept Section 21 is going, which is the most generous of things. The new provision under Section 8, where a landlord wants to get their property back, for example, because they're selling it or moving back in, is relatively generous on the basis that the property could return back to market within 3 months, on the basis of the property not selling. Now, if you look at where the market is at the moment, that's potentially likely, and actually, that 3 month window isn't awfully long. So, I appreciate the concern and I appreciate the challenges that this faces, but I would hope that there's an element of calm being brought to light and say, actually, look, there is a provision in here that's going to be helpful if you need to. I still believe, and will continue to believe, I think, unless presented with better evidence, that good landlords don't get rid of good tenants. So actually, in more cases than not, this isn't even relevant. And I think, understanding the scale of the challenge, if you look at your business demographic and you look at how many times you've served a Section 21, for example, of course you have, but it's not the majority of your business. And also, you've probably served that Section 21 for different reasons. Section 21 was a catch-all and is a catch-all and remains that until it's gone. And it actually covers up a multiple of sins in other functions that are weaker wordings, right? Section 8 being one of them. So I think as long as we can ensure that Section 8 is strengthened and is robust and we've got clarity, then I would hope actually the 49% of respondents here, their worries are somewhat allayed, and actually they can move forward with some confidence. But that's the point, right? We need clarity, and I think that's going to be a running theme as we go through today's session and maybe more sessions as well. Interestingly, 21% of respondents were mainly worried about assured tenancies, and I recognise that. We've been in a world of assured short-hold tenancies for a long time. That is a major structural change, and hopefully again today we can cover up some of the sort of changes and the way that the sort of knock-on effect of that change coming in as well. Okay, let's move on from our survey. We'll release more of this information over the coming weeks, but let's have a look back at the tenant fee ban. And I think it's probably a good sort of segue really there, Ryan, to talk us through and just remind us of the tenant fee ban timeline, because again, we're using that as some kind of indicator. Every bill is different, and we'll talk about specific timelines at the moment. But let's look back for a minute and recognise what went into the tenant fee ban in order to get it delivered.
So, yeah, I think the important thing is to say every bill is different. So whilst we can look at this for guidance, we have no way of knowing how long it's going to take to get this thing through Parliament. But in terms of when the bill was first delivered to Parliament to it being implemented on 1st of June 2019, there was about a 13-month period. So just to be clear, we're talking about implementation, not it passing the House of Commons, and a lot of people are confusing when the bill is going to pass through House of Commons and gain royal assent from when it's actually going to kick in, and there are actually different dates involved here, and the Tenant Fees Act provides a similar sort of structure. So the three key dates are when it passes the House of Commons, which by all accounts is probably the least relevant date, to be honest, because nothing starts at that point. It's just we know the final form of what the legislation is going to be. And then you have two dates. The first date for the Tenant Fees Act was the 1st of June 2019, in that new tenancies after that date were affected by it. And then you had a second implementation date, which was that you had essentially existing tenancies that renewed after a certain point were caught by 1st of June 2020. And that's a similar sort of setup to what's going to happen with this. You're going to have passing commons. There's going to be new tenancies affected past a certain point, that date to be confirmed. And then you're going to have all tenancies affected past a certain point, and similarly, that's to be confirmed.
And there are other areas in the bill, isn't there, Ryan, where they're probably in people's minds that they're part of the bill, the Decent Home Standard being one of them, for example, which 9% of people were worried about, actually. But actually, the bill itself hasn't confirmed the introduction of that at all. That's going to be something that they can bring in at a later date. So I think it's really important for everyone to understand the timeline, like you say, and I'm on board with you in terms of that first date probably being the least important, actually. But then understanding what what's coming after. And I think, it would be helpful if there is a somewhat of a set framework of which we can get notified of change and then have time to implement. Because if you look back at previous changes, and again, we're going to look back at Scotland and Wales and things like that in a minute. But in some cases, agents, landlords, and the whole sectors have been given very little time to respond. In other cases, they've been given ample time. So I'm sure as an industry, we would be enthusiastic to the point of having an ample amount of time to deliver change that isn't yet noted in the bill. But this bill will give them the powers to implement those changes, won't it, thereafter?
Yeah, absolutely. But they've kicked the can down the road, so to speak, with some of the more meatier elements. They just either haven't had time to put it into this bill, or maybe it's just been something that they'll think about and implement later on, or maybe it won't get implemented at all. But like you say, the like landlord register, decent home standards are things that can be introduced at a later date, and frankly, with little notice or scrutiny at all. We will just have to react to that when it happens. And I would just hope that the government would give us a bit of warning that something's going to happen before it actually kicks in. Because, like you say, they've got to communicate these things. Otherwise, it's not going to be evenly rolled out.
Indeed. Vicky asked this morning, good morning, Vicky. I hope you're well. Was the gap between passing House of Commons and implementation 13 months? Did she hear that correctly, Ryan?
No, so I probably should have done a better job of this. It entered the House of Commons in May 2018. It gained royal assent, which means it passed through Parliament in February 2019, with the implementation date being 1st of June 2019. So that total period from first bill to implementation was 13 months, but it got through Parliament in 9 months, if my maths is correct.
Thank you for confirming. Kate as well. Good morning, Kate. I hope you're well on this sunny morning. I feel in the long run, rents will raise again, not what Shelter want. So good for landlords and agents as commissions will go up. If a tenant is being difficult and a landlord can't get them out apart from selling, less properties and rents go up. Who's going to win? No one has thought this through. I think Kate's absolutely right to point out that there's these squeezes on all areas, and it's not just tenants. I read an article in the Telegraph yesterday that was suggesting, I think, on new properties that the landlord's profit, as it were, on the properties has dramatically fallen in the last year, which is somewhat understandable given interest rises, inflation, etc. I think the point around, and we haven't actually got a segment in for this, but I think it's a worthy talking point, which I'm going to try and segue into Kate's point, if I may. I think the point around, not being able to get them out apart from selling. If you look through the bill, there is arguably some level of generosity, and I please don't just pivot on that word, because I think it is very much more supportive of tenants than landlords. But there are some levels of generosity in the bill for landlords. One of them, I would argue, is the 3-month timeline from the point of selling, because I don't think that's that long, actually. And Shelter are calling for 2 years, by the way. So, I think the government has tried to be as fair to landlords there as possible. But the other side of this bill, and something that hasn't got a lot of airtime, but is worth you all reading and getting to grips with, is the antisocial behaviour clause. Because the antisocial behaviour clause in the bill, Ryan, the wording is changing, and it's changing to, I think, something along the lines of being capable of. And at the moment, there is absolutely no burden of proof or clarity about how you prove somebody is capable of. I would argue, Ryan, you are capable of being antisocial. I'm sure you're never antisocial, but you're definitely capable, as am I.
I've had my moments.
But my point here is that is an extremely lax clause. And it should be noted that change of wording didn't have to happen, but it is. I expect it to get more attention, and I do expect it to be challenged, especially by certain areas. But in reality, there is going to be a clause within this that means that you may have almost instant gratification on the grounds of antisocial behaviour. And it's worth reminding everybody that those grounds at the moment in the bill are noted as 2 weeks notice, far shorter than anything else. Now, this needs to be clarified, and I'm a big believer in actually any grey areas being just ultimately unhelpful, Ryan, because, hey, they get through to the courts, and the courts don't really know what to do, and they take their own precedence. But I think it's worth pointing out it's not just around landlords selling up, and there's a level of clarification needed to understand how that could be utilised. Because at the moment, I think it's fair to say, even in antisocial behaviour cases, Section 21 is being used almost, or other means are being used, because it's very hard to win a case just solely on that. That's something we should watch, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm with you in a sense of, if you accept that Section 21 going is a loss to a landlord's ability to recover possession of the property. All the improvements to Section 8 are generous. It's more than the government had to do. They could have just banned Section 21s. But it's still a net loss overall. And you're quite right. I have personal experience that if you have antisocial tenants and you can serve a Section 21 notice presently, you might still just want to consider serving a Section 21 notice. And so if you are deprived of that opportunity in the future, you have to rely on these discretionary grounds. Now, I don't know if it's appropriate to do it, but in one of the questions we were asked beforehand, it was specifically about antisocial behaviour, and I have an answer for it. So I figure since I'm going to answer that question anyway, I may as well do it now.
Sure.
That wording of likely to cause. So this is all about ground 14, which currently exists in broadly the same form as it will exist in the Renters Reform Bill. And it's basically causing it's nuisance to neighbours, nuisance to landlord, nuisance to landlord staff, letting agents. But the thing is about ground 14 is it is a discretionary ground. And so whilst it might be easier to say someone is likely to cause nuisance rather than is causing a nuisance, the threshold that the court has to reach is essentially, is this such a serious issue that we have no choice but to make someone homeless? And that issue currently exists with ground 14 as it's currently written. It will exist with ground 14 as it will be amended. So in that sense, the wording change, it might be easier to serve a notice on ground 14, but I would say it's not going to be any easier to actually get possession of the property, because you will still have to convince a court that there's such an issue going on. They have no choice but to evict. And that only happens in the most extreme antisocial behaviour cases, in which case the old wording would have got possession on anyway. So that's what I'm trying to say, is I don't think there's a practical difference for antisocial behaviour.
I don't think in the current form there is, but if we get clarity on what actually constitutes that, and this is something that a number of groups are asking for, then actually there could be a more viable framework there, because at the moment it's relatively open-ended. And James makes a good point actually in the chat. 2 weeks for ASB, antisocial behaviour, will cause more problems than it solves. Tenants will not move out in 2 weeks and court action for an order will be required. In reality, it's 6 months given current court backlogs. It's not as straightforward, but again, my sort of ask here from the government is, and other parties too, and is, can we have just some clarity on what we're deeming as antisocial behaviour and what the thresholds are? Because if that is provided, then I would expect that framework to be easier to manage than it ever has been. I appreciate we've got plenty of questions coming in. Amanda, good morning to you. I think my landlords are more concerned they have no planning ability with periodic type tenancies, that they could have all their tenants move out at the same time in, say, December. Their thoughts are you wouldn't want to evict good tenants, so getting bad tenants out of Section 8 sits comfortably with them. So I think Amanda there is taking the point, actually, I probably have got everything I need in Section 8, but hey, this whole move to assured tenancies, it feels a bit risky. I'm losing control. Let's just jump on a slide, Sarah, because I want to just hold that Amanda's point there just for a minute, and we'll come on to it in the following slide. This gives the attendees here an idea, doesn't it, Ryan, of what the kind of direction of travel is. So we're having to go through the House of Commons first, the House of Lords, and then final stages. Do you have any idea on how long each individual part takes, or is it how long is a piece of string, basically?
I'm afraid I can only speculate. So you're quite using the travel analogy. These are the stops on the path, but how long it's going to take in between each stop, I'm afraid I can only speculate. If we use the Tenant Fees Act as a guide, then it would be passing in February next year to be implemented in June next year. But it's not necessarily. In fact, I say it's not going to take the same length of time as the Tenant Fees Act because we have no idea how long this is going to take.
Indeed, and I think the important point here is that this is now open to debate in the House of Commons first and the House of Lords. There are plenty of feelings around all different elements of the bill, and it's probably a timely reminder that in order to affect those changes, maybe the best course of action here is to speak to your local MP. I fully appreciate sometimes that feels futile. However, I would argue it's better to do that than nothing. And ultimately, there's been cases more recently, actually, of looking through some industry stakeholders where they've actually broken through. They've managed to get a meeting with their local MP, and they're in listening mode, I think. And I think it's fair to say that the House of Commons and the House of Lords will be sympathetic to landlords' needs and fully aware, hopefully, especially now, that there is more pressure on landlords than ever before. So the design of this bill may well change as it goes through the process. And Ryan, that's exactly the point, isn't it? That's the point of the two phases in both houses is to take challenge and change a bill for the greater good. If the device works, then that's what we should end up with.
Yeah, if I had to estimate how long it would take, I would say it would be longer than the Tenant Fees Act, simply because I would anticipate there being a lot more backbench MP interest in this thing. I mean, simply by virtue of the fact that more MPs are landlords than they are letting agents. And again, the Tenant Fees Act mostly impacting on letting agents as opposed to this impacting on the entire rental sector. There's going to be a lot more MPs with a stake in it. There's going to be a lot more people petitioning their MPs to say, to protect their interests. So yes, I think there's going to be a lot more discussion about this, and discussion ultimately means delay. So if I had to put money on it, I would say it's going to take longer than Tenant Fees Act did. Yeah,
agreed. Brian, good morning. Brian asks an interesting question. What happens if there's a change of government? Now, I think he's probably asking us for us to predict the future, which is a fool's game in some respective Ryan. But I think from a Labour perspective, any party could win it, I'm sure, but I'm gonna say that it's one of two.
I feel like we have to be like the BBC, where other political parties are available. No one knows what the next government's going to be. However, if it were Labour, I've no reason to doubt that they would follow a similar path to this. So I think this has got broad cross-party support. So I would expect Labour to follow this through with their own spin on it, perhaps.
Yeah, indeed. And I think actually Lisa Nandy has already outlined what their 100-day plan would be. And it frankly includes most of this stuff. A bit about leaseholders as well, which I think is interesting.
It could be quite relevant in the context of Wales, because the Welsh Assembly, as I should use the proper term, is Labour-led, I believe, and there has been a whole raft of tenancy changes in Wales. So obviously it's its own thing, but it might be indicative of the kind of approach that Labour might take.
Indeed. And we talk about Wales there. Let's move on to a slide, because what a lovely segue, Ryan. You're on fire this morning. There are lessons to be learned from Scotland and Wales, right? And they have gone through legislative change. And actually what's interesting is one hasn't followed the other. They are slightly different in their approaches, actually. Do you want to talk us through what we've seen across the two borders and how that potentially informs us of our position at the moment?
So obviously all of the devolved nations have their own housing policy, which means that it goes down its own path. I'll start with Wales, because Wales and England are probably the closest aligned. Certainly after renters reform, Wales and England will be quite closely aligned in a number of areas. And there is an extent of copying each other's homework. Wales copied some nice bits of England legislation. For example, Tenant Fees Act, the Welsh equivalent is more or less verbatim a copy of it. But then you see similar sorts of things where in Wales, all landlords have to be registered with a body called Rent Smart Wales. That the England registration process, which isn't fully fleshed out, is surely going to resemble something very similar to Rent Smart Wales. So you can see that they are very closely aligned in a number of areas. The key difference, I would say, after renters reform is that Wales chose to keep an equivalent of Section 21. It's called a Section 173 notice, but the notice period for that is 6 months, and it can't be served during a fixed term. So, and again, also they have a fixed term and periodic setup in Wales. So I think once renters reform comes in, England's probably going to be more progressive than Wales, which will probably mean the Welsh are going to want to catch up again. So, Wales is probably an illustration of a more modest reform, and I think there's probably a lot of comparisons and similarities between the two formats once renters reform comes in. Scotland is probably the best example that things could be worse. In Scotland, you have two things which I think are scaring landlords at the moment, the possibility of. You've got rent freezes, so controlled rents, and you have eviction moratoriums, i.e. evictions cannot take place. I just want to say, really, this is what the government could have done. The government could do whatever they want, but luckily they are listening to an extent to the PRS, and that means that we get these concessions like all the new Section 8 grounds and things like that. So, lessons from Scotland is maybe don't look a gift horse in the mouth.
Yeah, and the way in which they've enacted those changes has been slightly different too, hasn't it? And if focusing on one area, for example, like the change to tenancies, if you look at how what paperwork, for example, had to be sent out and the follow-up work, it is wildly different. And I think we'll get to a point where we just accept these are the changes. The question then is, how do I implement those changes? And there is some good examples and bad examples, actually, including Northern Ireland, I think, Wales and Scotland, of approaching this either simplistically or indeed making it extremely difficult. I know from a Welsh perspective, plenty of agents have had real problems with having to remove and react quite quickly, and actually sending documentation that doesn't actually make much sense and isn't easy to digest by the people that it's meant to help. So I think, I suppose to the people attending today, expect to see sessions as we go through that timeline you saw earlier, as we get more certainty, expect to see more sessions on the how, because I'm crucially aware that's going to be fundamental to how businesses operate. But also, as good business owners, you're going to want to know what to do and get ahead of that in time, so you can sort of speak to your customer and say, listen, we're taking care of you. And that filters straight back up to suppliers as well. And, we're definitely going to be wanting, from a Goodlord perspective, to support you as much as we possibly can to automate as many of these changes as we possibly can too. But definitely, I think lessons to learn there from Scotland and Wales. If you look at the two markets as well, I think it's worth looking to market conditions. And your point, Ryan, around Scotland not only being, from a legislative perspective, far harsher, but also the market has changed quite considerably. Letting agents talk, I would suggest, if you've got any friends in the industry in either Scotland or Wales, it may be worth dropping them a call and asking them to see how things been going on the ground, but also look towards the data. Scotland in particular has seen, real pressure on their market, far more actually than we have so far in England. And actually, we're feeling pressure at the moment. So it's a really good example of where legislative change can actually hinder a market. And to your point, Ryan, maybe we should feel somewhat lucky we're not in that world. Lesser of two evils, one would argue. I'm sure there's plenty of opinion on whether that's a fruitful conversation or not, because, hey, people, don't want the change in some respects, and I get that, but it's coming, right? And I think you're right to point out with a fairer side of it than we could have been. There is lots of questions coming in. So I'm going to take a few of these, and then we're going to go on to the questions that we've had submitted already. And hopefully, most of these questions are of interest to everybody, so you can all take something from this. I want to get to a question from Greg I've seen pop up. We've got a couple on the same point. So Greg, good morning, Greg, says about serving Section 21 now. Bailiff evictions have been suspended until further notice. Is it likely that Section 21 is already dead in the water in anticipation of the renters' reform?
This is a different issue entirely. So some of you may well have read in the trade press that county court bailiffs are suspending evictions. From what I've seen, it's 3 courts. Now, unfortunately, if you live in that area and your properties are in that area, that's unfortunate for you. But the 3 courts that I'm aware of that have definitely suspended evictions are Barnet County Court, Clerkenwell and Shoreditch, and Central London County Court. So anywhere else in the country, as far as I'm aware, evictions are still taking place. So the rationale behind this is that I believe a bailiff got stabbed because he didn't have adequate protection equipment when he was carrying out an eviction. And so bailiffs have essentially gone on strike. That's what's happening here. They're saying they're not going to carry out these evictions. Now, this affects Section 8 claims as well. So it isn't just Section 21 being affected by this. It's all claims that necessitate an eviction date. So I don't think that situation is at all sustainable. I think it's quite likely the bailiffs are going to get what they are asking for, which is stab-proof vests, effectively, for the most risky assignments. And I don't think anyone can begrudge them that. That seems like quite a fair thing to ask for, to be honest. But anyone with experience in the court system will know that bailiffs are not at all quick at the moment. There's too few bailiffs, so too many evictions. And so even if they are taking place, it's still slow. I believe that answers the question, but I probably meandered a little bit.
No, I think it does. And Sophie sort of supports and asks a question around this point, actually. How do you think the increased use of Section 8 notices will impact the courts? Surely the influx of use of Section 8 will cause major delays in being seen by courts, causing further delay in gaining possession of the property back. Interested to hear your thoughts, Sophie. Thank you for your question. We actually covered this as part of our manifesto launch, and we were asked a question by one of the audience members on the night. I was on the panel along with William Reeve, our CEO, Greg Toosman from Property Mark, and Martin Gerard. And my answer to the question was, what would you do? What would be your first action if you were made housing minister? Something along those lines. My answer was to work more closely with Ministry of Justice and sort the courts out, because I think this is exactly the right question to be asking at the moment. Now, Ryan, what are they suggesting in the bill? They are suggesting they're going to digitise some of the processes further. I've not seen anything more on that.
I think this goes back to the white paper, and that they made a broad allusion to the fact that there was going to be some form of mediation to maybe avoid court entirely, and there was going to be better investment in the courts, which is absolutely necessary in all parts of the courts. More investments required, but I don't think it's been fleshed out in any meaningful way in the bill. And like I say, this is essentially a Treasury or a Ministry of Justice decision as to how well funded the courts are. We are just collateral damage, really, in the sense of the courts being underfunded for a sustained period of time. I think a likely solution, if I'm just going to give my frank opinion on it, is I would expect court fees to go up. We haven't had an increase in the court fee to issue a possession claim, which is £355. That hasn't been increased for, I hesitate to guess, but I think about 5 or 6 years. And the idea of that is that the cost of running the court should be paid for by the people using it. So I suspect rather than there being an increase in funding from the Treasury, I think it's far more likely you just see court fees increasing, bearing in mind the rate of inflation as well. £355 is almost a relative bargain these days compared to how you have the same cost of the same thing 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I probably wouldn't go out to your landlords, guys, and say, "Don't worry, Mr. Landlord, this is a bargain." They're not going to feel that way, right? But I think it highlights the need for things like rent protection and legal expense cover. And I'm not here to pitch that. You as professionals will make your own informed decisions. However, I think that level of product becomes more of a necessity than it ever has done before, especially in these kind of uncertain times where backlogs get bigger and the amount of arrears that could accrue could get even larger and larger. So the type of policy you're buying, I think, becomes more important. Eugene asks a question just on this point, which I don't think is covered off on the questions that we've had submitted already. Good morning, Eugene. He says, he asks, the bottom line is no evictions without a court order, even after the bill has passed. Is that correct, Ryan?
There's no fundamental changes to the way that an eviction will happen. So all of this is underpinned by the Protection from Eviction Act, which says essentially you can't unlawfully evict someone, and that basically means that you need to first of all serve them the notice, you need to first of all go to court on that notice, obtain a possession order, and then only then can a county court or a high court bailiff evict the tenant from the property. So all that structure is still in place.
Fantastic, thank you. We've got a question in from Joseph on Section 13. We're gonna come on Section 13 shortly. We also had a question, and forgive me, I've lost the name of the individual who asked it, asking how to go about rent reviews. Which again will be covered in Section 13. Section 13 is going to be the device for that, for the individual who asked the question. Apologies, I've missed your name on there. So let's revert to some of the most asked questions we've had in ahead of this, because some of the themes are popping up on the chat as well, and I think this is an interesting part of the session to ensure we're giving some clarity on some of these points. So let's start, Ryan, with tenant management and risk mitigation. This is going to feel like an interrogation, Ryan. It's designed to fill out that. We need your answers within 10 seconds. Move on to the next one. It's quick fire.
It's mastermind, isn't it? That's fine.
Test your thinking.
So luckily, I've already answered the first one, which is the grounds for eviction, the legislative provisions for problematic tenants. That's ground 14, which I discussed earlier. It's having a wording tweak, but fundamentally, it's still a discretionary ground. The court has still got a lot of scope to say, I'm not going to evict. And you would need to have a really problematic tenant to get possession on a discretionary ground. So in that sense, I think it's more or less business as usual. I think there's no real change to ground 14, practically speaking.
Okay. And it feels like we've partly covered off, maybe in different ways, the second question: what will be the impact of the Renters Reform Bill on the eviction processes? So
there was a bit of this I wanted to talk about a little bit more, which is obviously with Section 21's going away, you've also got accelerated claims going away. what that means is that all notices that are served will need to go in front of some form of court, some form of hearing, and that will probably cause pressure on the court system, because I think that's probably what the questioner was asking before, was what impact is that going to have? All claims now require a hearing. That is going to cause an impact, but I suspect something that might mitigate it slightly is that if you take away Section 21, there might be fewer claims in total. So it might be a little bit of column A, column B, so it might well offset itself. Ultimately, I think the time scales are only going to decrease if there is more funding put in place, rather than the changes that are proposed in the white paper and in the bill.
Yeah, and it's hard to stress enough, I think, for those who's working really closely within that legal system. And for me, it's to join to the rent protection and legal expense product we support. And Ryan, it's your day job, frankly. It's hard to stress enough how creaky that process is and can be, and how much stress it's been under, not only because of this reform, but COVID was clearly a massive challenge. And there was legislative means obviously put in place during the pandemic in order to support people, but that created huge backlogs on the courts. And we're only now just seeing those timelines start to decrease. I don't think they ever get back to where they were pre-pandemic, frankly. And I think this, again, will push those back out again. Your point around funding is absolutely the right one. And, you know, if you are speaking to your local MPs, if you are speaking to any industry professionals, that I think needs to be included in the conversation, because without that, actually, this bill will lack teeth. And the very point we got from our focus groups was that the vast majority of people, both landlords, tenants and agents, were on board, right? This change is happening, but it's got to be enforceable and it has to be managed properly. And that provides a fair outcome for all then. If we don't have that, then there's a real risk here that timelines can just get longer and longer. Especially to your point, Ryan, if those level of claims don't reduce and actually we see an increase in calls for the courts, then that could be disastrous. So it's going to be very interesting to see how and when that's funded. I hope it's ahead of the bill being launched, not retrospectively, because that will spell a bit of disaster. The next question comes in. Will the switch from fixed term to periodic tenancies affect insurances and affordability? One for me, probably more than you there, Ryan. The view from a referencing perspective on affordability is indeed a snapshot in time. It's looking at whether the tenant can afford that amount of rent, not whether the tenant can afford that amount of rent for the next 2, 3, 4 years, for example. So I don't think fundamentally anything within the referencing process particularly changes. We're going to come on to rent in advance, I think, shortly, and I'll probably blend that into guarantors as well. I'll cover guarantors here because it's a fair question around affordability. So I think, broadly speaking, referencing process remain the same. There is a question around guarantors in terms of now there will be no fixed term contracts. How can you hold somebody to a contract in perpetuity? And I think that's a very interesting question, one that we don't quite have an answer for yet, and we're looking for support on as well. Because, you know, for any contract to be enforceable, my understanding, Ryan, is that you need a determined range. It needs to be clear what they're signing up for, what they're liable for. And at the moment, if you read the bill, rent is classed as 1 month, which again informs our position on one of the questions coming up on rent in advance. But I think guarantors are a question mark. When it comes to insurances, I can't speak on behalf of others, but from a Goodlord perspective, we've already met with our insurers. We've gone through exactly what we think the implications of the bill in the current form are, and we expect to be able to conduct business as usual and further support actually some of the areas. So I think you see those areas improve, if anything. And I think, again, to my point, Tila, that becomes maybe more meaningful, given how uncertain, you know, from a legality perspective, people might feel. So, yeah, we're absolutely open to supporting customers through this period and on from there. Looking into the financial and legal considerations, a question came in, Ryan, the impact of the Renters Reform Bill on fixed-term tenancies and restructuring fees. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I assume this is to do with essentially there's not going to be a renewal fee anymore. That's
what I read there.
So, yes, I mean, simply put, there is not going to be a renewal fee anymore because there's not going to be that requirement to do it. I suppose the answer would be to shift fees into being, you know, along the X percentage of rent you deduct each month for your services. But yeah, it's difficult to see how that wouldn't, you know, if you don't make those changes, it wouldn't be a net loss overall because obviously you're doing less work, you're going to get paid less for it. So yeah, I'm afraid I don't really have much more insight than that. Yes, renewal fees will disappear entirely, and that's a revenue stream that I'm sure a lot of agents reliable.
Indeed, we've got a few questions coming in. One from somebody who hasn't left their name. I'm not sure whether this is a fraudulent slip or not, but it says, "Is that a Spurs shit in the background?" I think they mean shirt. It is. And I can't change my room depending on how well we play. So apologies for any offence caused. Hopefully next season will be much better. In terms of some other questions coming in around the points just discussed, Vicky asks, does the bill cover own AST and exclude non-housing act tenancies, Ryan?
Yeah, so essentially it works by taking away the AST provision, but you still have a list of tenancies that cannot be ASTs. That exists currently. I don't believe that list is going to be changed at all. So, for example, if you're letting to a company, that can't be an AST. If it's not their principal residence, that can't be an AST. There's a whole list of exclusions set out in Schedule 1 of the Housing Act. And yeah, like I say, not going to be changed.
Cool. And Claire, good morning, Claire, asks, considering the bill is designed with greater protections for the tenants in mind, I'm struggling to understand the benefits of the removal of fixed terms. How do we explain this to tenants who feel like they have lost their security protection from the sale of their home? Claire, this point was actually brought to us in the focus groups by tenants. And I think it's an interesting one. And I'd go back to our conversation at the top of the call around, I think we're moving to assured tenancies and it's done. But I absolutely sympathise that there are a cohort of tenants out there, and that was evident in our research, that did and enjoyed the idea of a fixed term contract. It gave levels of security, albeit maybe the security actually wasn't there because the device is available to agents and landlords at the moment. But I do get the point, and I think it's one that ultimately, we've probably got to recognise people are choosing their home. There was a fear, I remember, Ryan, when this bill was first announced, that all of a sudden the POS would turn into Airbnb style and people would be that transient. I just don't recognise that's a possibility given the stresses on supply and demand at the moment. But I think Claire makes a fair point there, that there will be some tenants sit there scratching their heads thinking, hang on, why can't I have certainty here? I want a fixed term. But under the new legislative terms, that's not going to be a possibility, is it, for tenants moving forwards?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you said. I don't think there's need to repeat what you said.
Okay, looking back to the questions we've got ahead of the time, and this is quite a big one. Can we still take rent in advance if there are no fixed terms?
Right. Now, I'm more than happy to talk about this because all lawyers want to be like the lawyers you see on TV where they're finding loopholes, clever ways to get around stuff. If I'm putting money on a loophole existing, this is it. Now, what you currently have when you take rent in advance is you're basically just putting the rent account in credit. Because what tends to happen, again, not in all cases, but what tends to happen is, say, a 12-month fixed term, they pay 6 months of that up front, and then they pay the remaining 6 months every month thereafter. Practically speaking, that's no different to it being 12 lots of 1 month. It's just they happen to have paid all 6 months in advance. There's no law against being in credit for your rent account. There's no problem at all with that. Now, the bill as written prevents rental periods from being over 1 month. So you're not going to be able to ask for a year's rent up front. But why wouldn't you be able to ask for 12 lots of 1 up front, which is the same amount? It's just that you're asking for it in a slightly different way. And again, if a tenant pays it, all they've done is they've put the account in credit. You haven't demanded anything more than 1 month's rent, albeit you've demanded several lots of 1 month's rent in advance. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say, I think that particular interpretation is not long for this world. I think that is almost certainly going to get clamped down on. It certainly isn't the spirit of the legislation. It's quite clear what Parliament's intending to do. But the law as written just prevents the rental period from being longer. It doesn't prevent you from demanding multiple rental periods at the same time. And that's my bit of being a law geek.
I feel like we're an episode of Suits here. It's brilliant. Ryan, Greg asks, though, to this point, and it feels like he says rent in advance can probably be navigated using existing law. So I think he's thinking in similar ways to you here. However, he asks, where if a tenant leaves early, a refund of overpaid rent will be due. Now, naturally, you'd think, yes, you're leaving early, you've paid me rent up front, I'm going to give it to you back. I'm not sure under that mechanism you just described, there would be a necessity to give it back. I certainly do not agree with that, by the way. I think that's morally a little bit wrong because, you went into it in good faith, both parties. But how would tenants have protection over that payment? Because in that loophole, would they not be exposed to it being retained?
So it's not really that well known about, but in the Deregulation Act, which is kind of the legislation which said that Section 21 notice doesn't need to expire at the end of the rental period, it was anticipated that Section 21 notice would expire in the middle of a rental period, and that would mean if a tenant's paid a month's rent, then part of it would need to be refunded. And there's a formula for it that I'm not mathematically able to pull apart here. But the idea was that there was some mechanism whereby if they left midway through a rental period but paid for the whole period, some of it would be refunded to them. But there isn't such a formula here, and I wonder if it's because it would need to be the tenant giving the notice. So basically, if the tenant gives 2 months' notice and that notice doesn't expire at the end of a rental period, and either it would be on them to apportion the last month's rent themselves or come up with some solution, or if they had paid the full month's rent for it, to simply say, tough, you paid the full month's rent, you were contractually obliged to pay the full month's rent. The fact that the tenancy is ending midway through a rental period is neither here nor there. So I think this is something that could be expanded upon because they've done something similar in previous legislation.
Okay. Whilst we're on this point of rent in advance, Vicky asks, does the same apply to topping up? E.g., where the tenant passes references at 500, but the rent is 525, so pays 25 in advance. I think from a referencing perspective, I think this probably makes it harder because there's no definition of period of what that payment would look like, and there's no fixed term. Mm-hmm. So I think this is probably an area that we see less and less of in terms of referencing. Now, whether you can find a way to navigate it or not is a different question. But what this is known as a shortfall payment in referencing terms, and I think from what we understand at the moment, Vicky, that will become a thing of the past. Now, there are many areas here, like the one we're talking about now. We asked the question around guarantors, and I think it was one of the attendees today who was pointing out that this feels like actually it's restricting tenants. You can make a fair argument to say actually there's more barriers being put down because of this, unintentionally almost, that give people less access to property. These are two areas which I think are possibly proving that point, because you will have a cohort of individuals that really struggle to meet set criteria, but have found other means to get into property. Arguably, they're closing those loopholes, which actually in turn benefit tenants. Moving on, Ryan, I'm conscious of time. What will the enforcement of the new Section 8 grounds look like?
Now, I'm going to have to interpret enforcement here as being you've got a possession order and you've evicted the tenant. A tenant's left and they've left rent arrears, for example. How do you go about enforcing the debt against them? That's why I'm interpreting enforcement as essentially debt recovery. It's unaffected. So all the previous mechanisms for recovering money from a tenant, whether that's from the deposit or via small claims court, by instructing bailiffs, by applying for an attachment of earnings order, they all still exist and are completely unchanged. But I might have misinterpreted what the question's actually asking.
No, okay. I think we interpret it the same way. Tenancy agreements and types. I think two quick fire ones here. Do you have an idea what the tenancy agreements might look like for periodic tenancies or for assured tenancies, Ryan?
Yes, because you can currently create an assured tenancy. You can currently create a periodic contract. So it is not at all difficult to imagine what that might look like. You would just remove fixed term. There'll be some other tweaks required. In fact, I think the biggest tweaks are going to be related to Section 13 because they're doing away with rent increase clauses. So there are going to need to be some things removed from the agreement. I suspect that's going to result in a slimmer overall agreement, which, to be honest, is no bad thing. It's quite a bulky document at the moment.
And then the second follow-up question there is, what will tenancy agreements look like for student rentals? I think it's worth pointing out at this stage that this is one of the challenges that's come about already since the bill's been introduced. Currently the bill essentially gives different process and powers for PBSAs, so purpose-built student accommodation. And actually the ask here is that's not going to cut it, because you've got a huge volume of properties that sit within the PRS that rent to students, and actually this legislation is absolutely counterproductive for those landlords. We've seen change there already. I think it's going to be hard until we understand what that challenge looked like and where they finalise to be able to give an accurate answer right to what agreements would look like for students, because it probably is going to change, we hope.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
Going into Section 13, there's been a lot of questions around Section 13. So I'm going to probably start with the bottom question before we go through the rest maybe here, because I think it informs the rest of the points. So Ryan, what options do landlords have under the Renters Reform Bill for increasing rent?
Okay, two options, but really it's only one option, serving a Section 13 notice every 12 months to increase it to market rate. The second option is that you serve a Section 13 notice and then agree the rent increase with the tenant after you've served the notice, but that agreed rent can only be less than the Section 13 notice rent increase. So you can't have rent increase clauses, you can't have separate negotiations to amend the rent, you can't have a renewal setting the rent at a higher date. It can only be Section 13 and then maybe a negotiation after Section 13.
Okay. And then that leads on to the first question, top to bottom. If a tenant repeatedly challenges Section 13, would this be covered by the persistent arrears ground? Interesting. Somebody's trying to find a loophole here in the sense of ask for more money. Does this fall into bed with the new legislative change as well?
I like this one.
Agreed.
Someone's thinking ahead.
Yeah.
So with a Section 13 notice, essentially what you're saying is from a certain point, the rent will be X. Now it's possible for the tenant to challenge that. It can go to the property tribunal, and the property tribunal can then set whatever the fair that they think the rent should be. Now, I think as a whole, this is going to lead to a downward pressure on rent increases, because essentially you have I don't think they're government in the stricter sense of the word, but they are still HMCTS. They're still governed by the Ministry of Justice, and they can set what the market rate is. Now, it's possible for the tribunal to backdate the rent increase back to when it should have taken effect, but they won't always do that. But if they do backdate it, then it's entirely possible for tenants in rent arrears for whatever they haven't paid for the period from when they should have paid to when the rent was actually approved by the property tribunal. So yes, it's possible for rent arrears to accrue as a result of a Section 13 notice being challenged. Now, persistent rent arrears is ground 8A. That's the new ground, but that only applies if they are in more than 2 months arrears for a period of time. So would the backdating of the rent create rent arrears of more than 2 months? If it does, then yes, that would be one tick against persistent rent arrears, and you need 3 periods where they've gone into more than 2 months arrears. But realistically, I don't think that's going to happen, because the tribunal will probably not backdate it if it meant such a severe impact on the tenant. So I don't think there's going to be any interaction between Section 13 and the new ground 8A.
Yeah, I agree.
And just to be clear, I just want to touch on a word. Sorry, there's a word in there which is repeatedly challenging it. So basically, is the act of challenging it in of itself a problem? No, it's not. The tenant's got every right to challenge a rent increase by Section 13. Yeah. So the challenging, even if every single Section 13 is challenged, doesn't lead to any extra avenues for getting them out of the property.
It doesn't. And I think, I would expect, I think people are more informed today than they were 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And I would expect to see the majority of these processes challenged in the first phase. Now, I think actually that dilutes itself over time, because people begin to learn and trust that actually there's a barometer there that is accurate and the system works. But I think we should be preparing for, the majority of Section 13 to be challenged. And if they don't, then great. And I suppose my point on that is, why wouldn't a tenant challenge it? There's absolutely there's no fallback if the tenant challenges it and they don't win that case. It's a free throw basically. Now that really informs concern around the first tier tribunal bandwidth and their ability to serve and the ability to manage cases. I'm not quite sure they've factored in how high this could be. And I think the missing link here is that we will drive this as an industry. Landlords and agents will drive this, because this is a route to ensuring that they have the ability to cover their costs, especially in a changing world. And given the fact you can only do this once every year via Section 13, that's going to create pressure in itself. It'll be interesting to see how many Section 13s are served at the very start of this legislative change, the moment they can, basically, to try and make the most of the timeline. But I think we need more clarity around this. We need more clarity around, how long is that process? Because what the landlords do in the meantime, there's a lot of sort of grey areas in this that I think need to be confirmed, both from a legislative perspective, but also from a bandwidth perspective. The next question on here is: could the government introduce measures to prevent landlords gaining possession before this new legislation is in force?
Short answer: yes, they could. As see Scotland as an answer for that. Practical reality: I doubt it highly.
And with that in mind, in terms of other challenges, what will happen regarding giving notice for joint tenancies?
Now, I don't think this is any different. Now, there is a bit in the Renters Reform Bill about tenants giving notice. There is a prescribed period of notice that they need to give. But the legislation talks about a tenant. So not tenants, not the tenancy or anything like that. And it is currently the position that joint tenants can sever their individual liability in a periodic contract by giving their own notice to quit. So in that sense, I don't think there's any change. It's possible for a tenant to give a notice to quit, to end their tenancy, or rather just end their portion of a tenancy once it's in a periodic contract. Now, all tenancies are going to be in a periodic contract. It's entirely possible for you to sign up 2 tenants, get affordability and insurance based on 2 tenants, and then the second tenant to waltz off into the sunset, leaving the first tenant who can't afford it. So nothing's changed, I suppose, is the short answer for tenants being able to give their notice in joint tenancies.
Okay, and a question going back to, shall we move on to the last couple of questions on the slide? A question coming in from a couple of people, one including Tom. Good morning, Tom. What if the tenant doesn't comply with the Section 30 rent increase? That just starts accruing arrears, right? And that there's a mechanism within the framework for arrears. It's no different to any other part of non-payment of rent, I'd imagine.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the same as currently. If you serve a Section 30 notice and a tenant doesn't contest it, then the rent has increased to that amount. If they don't pay that amount, then they will be in rent arrears by that amount for every month that passes that they don't pay the increase. So there's no change there.
And in terms of limitations, there's a couple of questions around limitations, including one from Steve. Russell makes the point as well around the barometers being set for the amount of rent that can be applicable. Steve's question pertains to: is there a limit to the rent increase I can charge? That, I presume, Ryan, is set by the market rates that then will be acting as a guide, I imagine.
Yeah, exactly. You've got this nebulous term, market rate, so there isn't a cap. You can make extraordinary increases in rent if the market justifies that increase. But like I said, there could be a downward pressure on the market rent because it's the tribunal who are going to be setting that market rent. So I think it might just be watch this space and see what happens, because your valuation as a letting agent might be a property is worth X, but if the tribunal sets it at a lower rate, then effectively the market rate is not X. It is whatever the tribunal will set it at. Like I said, that's rent controls right a back door, really. Indeed.
And 2 questions just on the point you've recently made around joint tenants. One coming from Ivor and Claudia. Claudia asks, I thought joint and severally liable tenants could give notice and that notice affects the tenant as a whole.
No. So in a periodic contract, an individual tenant can give their own notice to end the tenancy. It's kind of like we were talking about with guarantors earlier. There can't be a situation where someone is bound or made liable in perpetuity. And so if you consider the common context here is, what if there's, say, a domestic violence situation going on here? You've got both named tenants. If one person wants to leave that situation because the relationship is broken down, but the other party is essentially forcing them to stay party to this contract because they signed the same agreement, it would be incredibly unfair to the tenant who is forced to stay to it. So yes, there is a provision that joint tenants can sever their liability in a periodic contract.
Okay, good clarification, that, because I think that's a point that quite a few weren't aware of. Moving into the last few questions, Ryan, will EPC rules form part of the Renters Reform Bill?
I think they're talking about the MEES changes.
I think
that's their own bit of legislation.
Yeah, of which we, I think, still waiting for absolute confirmation of when that's going to be introduced. The timeline's been moving about a bit. So, and maybe this is a precursor to that changing again, because this is probably going to be a focus above and beyond that potentially. Access to up-to-date information on legal requirements and best practice requirements. I think this is more of a ask rather than a question, and where to find them. I imagine actually your business, Ryan, does help provide most of this stuff, right?
Well, it's a very useful opportunity to plug services, to be honest. So I dare say there's going to be a lot of webinars as we get updates to the bill and as we get the final bit of legislation passed through the Commons. Dutton Gregory operate a private legal helpline for all members to join for an annual fee. We are currently in the process of revamping that to include a bit more of a proactive offering, to include things like webinars, how-to guides, written documents, things like that. So in terms of access to up-to-date information, just watch this space.
Thank you, Ryan. We've been hit with about another 13 or 14, if not more, questions back in again on top of the ones we've already got. Guys, I'm afraid we are out of time. 6 minutes over. I'm conscious that everybody has busy days, and appreciate all of you sticking with us. We do have another webinar coming up shortly with Sean Hooker. This is specifically around students and the effect of the Renters Reform Bill, an area that we've briefly touched on today with Ryan, but Sean will be joining me to give more context to that. I do appreciate there's been many more questions coming in. We will be running multiple sessions like this over the coming months. And I really hope that Ryan and others can join us again to give an update as we go through that timeline that we showed you earlier, to really give you certainty on what things have been confirmed and what things haven't, and then talk about those and try and help you prepare. But I think there's been some absolutely brilliant stuff in there today, Ryan. Thank you so much for your attendance again. And thank you to the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letting professionals that have joined us today. For today, that's it. Ryan, thank you. And we look forward to seeing everybody again shortly. Cheers now.
Thanks so much, Oli.
Bye-bye.